following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time you might be listening, welcome. Welcome to the program called Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm your host, Claire Hall, and I'm sure glad you've tuned in for this episode because I think it's going to be a very enjoyable program. Our guest this evening is Brian Sidney Parrott. And Brian, welcome, good evening, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Claire. No, I'm happy to be here and talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers and Dad's involvement with all of that. And I look forward to asking you at some point how you got to be such a Brooklyn Dodger fanatic.
Yeah, I'm glad to have, always glad to have a guest turn the tables on the host. But yes, we are talking about your father, certainly a pivotal figure in Brooklyn Dodgers history. His name was Harold Parrott. He was traveling secretary for the club, ticket manager, and he wrote, to me, one of the best and certainly one of the funniest baseball books ever called The Lords of Baseball. And I want to get into that book a little later in the program and its interesting history. But first off, we might have some younger folks listening. I think if they know the name Harold Parrott in relation to the Brooklyn Dodgers, they probably know him through the movie 42, the story of Jackie Robinson's arrival in the major leagues. And certainly, maybe the central characters to that story are Jackie Robinson and the general manager of the Dodgers, Branch Rickey. But, right after them, the character of Harold Parrott, who, again, was a real-life person, your father. So, tell us a little bit about your dad, his role with the Dodgers, and maybe especially his relationship with Rickey and Robinson.
Yeah, well, Dad was a sports writer in Brooklyn for the Brooklyn Eagle, which was the main newspaper in Brooklyn. And he went to work for the Eagle after he got his master's degree from St. John's University at 21 years old. He was hired by the Eagle right away. And then because one of the writers apparently had a drinking problem, they put him on the Dodgers at the age of 23. And Dad covered the Dodgers in Brooklyn through all of those years. He, covered the Dodgers, and he would also write for extra money for the Sporting News and magazines. And he did an article in 1941 about the brain of baseball, Branch Rickey, and how smart he was and how much further ahead he was than most of the owners of the major league teams. And when Rickey was brought in 1943 to take over the Dodgers from Larry McPhail, he knew he had a friend in Harold Parrott because, Dad had appreciated his vision and everything that Rickey had done. And so he brought my father in, and Dad was a sports writer, and he said, Rickey said, well, the war effort is taking my traveling secretary, and I need to find another one, and I'd like your opinion, who would be the best choice to be the traveling secretary. And Dad said, well, that's a big question. Let me think about that, and I'll tell you tomorrow. So the next day, Dad came in, and and the two choices Rickey had mentioned were Buzzy Bavasi and also a guy named Ed Staples. And Dad said, well, Bavasi is much smoother with the writers, and he'll go out for a drink with them, and he's much more personable. Staples is more of a green eye shade type, and he won't make any mistakes on the rooming list and handling the money. And Rickey said, well, it's neither one I'm interested in. It's you. Would you take the job as the traveling secretary? And Dad told me, he said that was the way Rickey was one step ahead of him, getting him to think about the job. And he said there was the opportunity for added emoluments, meaning he could make more money if he had a chance. The traveling secretary in those days got a the player's cut of the World Series money. And so anyway, Dad accepted the job and became the traveling secretary in January of 1944.
And within a couple of years, that World Series money materialized, and it did for many, many years with the Dodgers, right?
Yeah, exactly. I have a canceled check, $4,000 that Dad got in 1947 for his part of the team. And so he did make some extra money, and he continued to write. He was a prolific writer and wrote for the sporting news and magazines. And Ricky was brilliant to pick Dad because, he was a publicity machine as well as a very good traveling secretary.
So you really got two jobs done for the price of one. Yeah, Branch Rickey, a pretty smart man to say the least. So let's talk about, the fact that your dad was, well, I was going to say had a front seat, but really no, he was at the table. He was a participant in, what I think arguably is the pivotal event of the 20th century in baseball, and really one of the pivotal events in American history, Branch Rickey's decision to break the color barrier and bring Jackie Robinson to the Dodgers.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I asked my father about all of that, and I said, how did Mr. Rickey bringing Robinson up to the Dodgers to you? And so Dad said, well, we were playing bridge. And he asked the question. He said, I'm thinking about bringing Robinson up in 47 in the spring, and I'd like to get your opinion. And they were playing bridge with Mrs. Rickey and the Rickey's daughter. And Dad said, well, Mrs. Rickey said, Branch, they call you El Cheapo. They're going to don't do it. They're going to criticize you. Let someone else do this. And then Mrs. Rickey said, his daughter said, Daddy, you've had one heart attack already at 63, and they thought the stress of the whole thing would be too much and, don't do it. And then when it came to my father, I said, what did you say? And he said, well, Ricky had assembled a team that could challenge the Yankees after all these years. And he said, why don't we almost won the pennant in 46 against St. Louis. Let's win the pennant in 47 and bring him up in 48. So Dad was saying, wait one more year. And Ricky's reply was, well, I've already decided we're bringing him up. So Dad knew at that moment he was going to be on the front lines with everything from the southern ball players that would react negatively to the idea as well as everything else. And so Dad certainly did have a front row seat with Jackie Robinson's being brought up to the major leagues. And so it is a fascinating thing and fun for me as a son to realize Dad was, stood up to all of the stuff that happened.
Yeah, he had to really take the flack just as much as Mr. Rickey did. And, quite a story. And, you and I have had a couple of telephone conversations about your dad and his relationship with the Brooklyn Dodgers before we recorded this program, and often talked through Facebook. And I mentioned the movie 42, and I think it was well done in so many ways. But something I said to you, of course, I never had the honor of meeting your dad, but I just felt his portrayal in the movie was all wrong. That as when I look at pictures of your dad, I see a guy who looks always upbeat, always smiling. His writing just sparkled with energy and wit. And the way he was portrayed in 42, he just came across as kind of this sour little guy. And, what was your response to that observation?
Well, exactly the same. It wasn't, as much as I loved the movie 42 and the movie was made, the portrayal of Dad as a Castro milquetoast was not accurate at all, because Dad was, at one point, and, jumping a little bit ahead maybe, when the first road trip that they made to Philadelphia, Ricky put Dad on the phone. He said, listen into this, and it was a call from the Philadelphia general manager who said, Branch, are you planning on bringing the N-word, are you planning on bringing him down with you on this first road trip to Philadelphia? And Ricky said, yes, we are. And the general manager said, of the Phillies said, well, we're just not ready for that yet. If you bring Robinson, we're not going to take the field. And then Ricky says, well, we'll be happy to take the forfeit, 9-0. He'll be on the team. And so Dad was, listening to that, said to me, he told me, he said, I sent 3 different mailings to the hotel in Philadelphia to make sure that they, knew that he was part of the team. And when they got down to Philadelphia, when they checked in the team, Dad said, well, they told him, he said, well, this is a 4 or 5-star hotel. We can't have a Negro staying at this hotel, and he can't stay here. So Dad said, all right, hold up the bags. We're not staying here. And he found another hotel for them to stay in. And so then what happened in Philadelphia, which is very well portrayed in the movie 42, how the manager, Ben Chapman, went after Jackie and all of that. When that series was over, Dad went to Forest Hills, to where Ricky lived, and he went into his house and he said, you've got to stop this. He's going to have a nervous breakdown, and we're going to be responsible for a man having a nervous breakdown. And Dad was telling Ricky, you can't do this to this guy. And Ricky then laughed, and Dad was surprised at his reaction. He said, now what's gotten into you? He said, now you're worried about him. What do you think is happening? And Dad said it was just not right, the way they're treating him. And Ricky said to my father, he said, Harold, on any team there are fair-minded men, and when they see how unfair the treatment of Robinson is, they'll rally around him. There's going to be an incident. I don't know where or when, but, it's going to happen. And Dad writes in the book, The Lords of Baseball, he said, Ricky could predict human behavior as accurately as I could read a railroad timetable, because the next trip into Cincinnati had happened. The incident, which was Pee Wee Reese putting his arm around Jackie in front of 32,000 people that were shocked. And so Ricky was a visionary, and Dad was there, and as you said, they told things to Dad that they would never say to Ricky. Well, actually, Ben Chapman, the Dad knew Ben Chapman, and he said to my father one time, he said, you know what, Parrott? You're going to wind up being nursemaid to 24 niggers and a dago. And then and Dad writes in the book, he said he didn't like Furillo either. But Dad said to Chapman, he said, you know what, Winslow, which was his nickname for some reason, he said, if I had a choice to room with you or 42, I'd pick 42 every time. And Dad thought that Chapman was going to punch him in the nose, but he didn't. But anyway, Dad took a lot of heat from the writers. Why did Ricky have to bring such an uppity black, somebody like Campanella, who was, much more likable, I suppose. But anyway, Ricky was a visionary. Dad was his right-hand man. And, and Dad and Jackie became very close friends. And after Jackie made it, Jackie had a radio show every Sunday night wherever they were, and Dad wrote the copy for him. And so they were, very close through the years. And anyway, it's a good story. And of course, again, as a son, I admire my father, standing up and supporting Jackie in what he went through.
Yes, indeed. It is a tremendous story, and of course, your dad's career in baseball continued with lots of interesting and amusing and amazing stories. Which I believe about 30 years later, he sat down to write his memoir, The Lords of Baseball. And so now, maybe Brian, I could answer the question you raised to me at the beginning of the program. How does somebody who was born after the Brooklyn Dodgers fled to Los Angeles, how does a person like me become such an obsessive Brooklyn Dodger fan? Well, I think you can trace it back to Gil Hodges and the summer of 1969, and the first year that I truly followed a baseball season from start to finish, and I just fell in love with the Mets that year. And so I don't know. And then my interest in baseball history grew out of that pretty quickly, and I learned that Gil had been a player, and his years of greatness were in Brooklyn. And then a couple of years later, I read The Boys of Summer, and at that point, I was pretty much hooked on the Brooklyn Dodgers and these men who were, not only great ball players, but just such amazing human beings. And through the years, I came across references to your father's book, and I was pretty good at hunting down, in those pre-internet days, hunting down even out-of-print books in used bookstores. But it was probably 15 years before I finally found a copy of it, and it was not in the best of shape, but I said, may never find another one of these again. I was almost beginning to think it was a legend, that it didn't exist. So you have shared with me a story of why it became such a scarce book, and I think that might be of interest to the people who are listening to our conversation. So please share that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Let me just bring you to the genesis of that book.
Sure.
When Jackie died in 1972, I was with Dad, and he said, my father was a prolific reader of national newspapers, and he had read the obituaries on Jackie, and he said they've already forgotten what he did. He said they think he's just a black malcontent because he's walking with Martin Luther King. But it prompted the obituaries, which didn't give Jackie credit for what he actually had done, prompted Dad to write an article, The Truth About Jackie Robinson, and he submitted it to the Sporting News, which he was, had contributed to for years. And so that article, which quoted Chapman and, started telling these stories, became, got circulation with the Sporting News. And when a publisher in New York realized who Dad was, how well he could write, and what he knew, they said, here's $20,000, we want a book. And so Dad, started writing the book, and he wrote it in Oregon, at our house in Portland. And Dad suggested a title for the book, and it was The Boneheads of Baseball. And he, one of the lines somewhere was, baseball must be the greatest sport to survive the men that run it. And so anyway, the publisher, which was Prager, was the name of the company, chose The Lords of Baseball as the title. And when the book came out, again, Dad was well known and respected in the journalism world, and the book was reviewed by 103 newspapers around the country.
Wow!
And very positively. One review that I loved the most was Jerome Holtzman of the Chicago Tribune Sun-Times. He said, we all knew Harold Parrott was a great writer, but we didn't realize he had such a ferocious desire to tell the truth. He said, for honesty, it is equal to, if not possibly surpasses, Ball 4. So anyway, the book, Dad got onto the Today Show with Garagiola, and so the book was out in 1976.
Uh-huh.
Now, then, as my father and, I'm the son, I never met anybody that didn't love the Lords of Baseball.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I asked my father in the 80s, I said, Dad, why didn't that book do better? He said, well, the reason is Walter O'Malley bought 12,000 copies and kept them out of circulation when the book was being reviewed so that nobody could read it. And at the time he said that to me, Claire, I thought, is that possible? Could a man be that manipulative that he would actually buy all the books to keep it out of circulation? And so when Dad died in 1989, maybe it was 87, I was with my oldest brother, Todd, and I said, Dad told me something that was hard for me to believe, that O'Malley bought all the books, the Lords of Baseball, to keep it out of circulation. Todd said, he told me that too. I said, Todd, if that's true, if there's any possibility that's true, we need to republish that book. And so my brother, who had done very well on Wall Street, he agreed, and we republished The Lords of Baseball. And I believe that's the reason it was back in circulation and was used for the screenplay for the movie 42.
Right, and it would also explain why it took me years to find a copy of the first edition, and I can just see how the devious mind of Walter O'Malley worked. Somebody goes to a bookstore and says, do you have the Lords of Baseball? And, of course, this is many, many years before the Internet and Amazon and all of that, and they say, no, we can't get it from the publisher, and people would tend probably not to be persistent. They just forget about it and look for something else. So, old Walter O'Malley, unfortunately, he managed to suppress it for a while, but I guess, to me, as Jerome Holtzman said, it's an honest book. It's a funny book, and really, not only the saga of Jackie Robinson, but in other aspects, it's really an important contribution to baseball history as well. So, I use this program, among other things, to promote my favorite books, and I know I've got a lot of listeners who love baseball books, and I'm telling them right now, the second edition that Brian and his brothers brought out, it is still widely available, so hunt one down and settle in for some great storytelling.
Yeah, it's a terrific book, and Dad was, had a good sense of humor, and it's a very readable book. You can pick up any chapter and enjoy it. when I told my brother, I said, well, I'll do the book tour, because I had been, somewhat experienced in media, running the Davis Cup in Portland and doing other things. And so I did the book tour and went around the country and set up book signings. But I got on NPR with his name was Edwards, maybe.
Bob Edwards.
Anyway, yeah. And so I got on there, and I walked into the studio in Washington, D.C. He said, "My God, could your dad tell a story?" He said, "I just wish I was in the same room with Red Barber and your father just to listen." And so that interview, which the morning edition or whatever his show was called, was 13 million listeners. And one of the listeners was Sports Illustrated, and then they contacted me and they did a full-page review that the sons were bringing out the father's work, and it really took off. And so we wound up, selling a lot of the book, in the second edition. And, I think, again, that's, one of the reasons that it got back out in circulation, that it was used for the movie 42.
That's great. And just by pure happenstance, I stumbled on another of your father's books, so I didn't know it, but let me share this. I just think it's interesting serendipity. I'm looking on Amazon all the time for new or re-released baseball books. And here, a couple of years ago on Kindle is The Dodgers and Me by Leo DeRocher, an autobiography of Leo published in 1948. I had read Leo's more recent autobiography, Nice Guys Finish Last, right after it came out, but, I downloaded it, I read it, and I remember saying on one of the Brooklyn Dodger pages that I administer and that you're a member of, that, wow, this was a really good read. And you said, well, your dad was the ghostwriter. And so I said, no wonder. And didn't he have a very short time to knock that whole book off?
Yeah, he did. In fact, I asked him about it when I was driving him to Los Angeles, only a month before he died. I said, tell me about the Dodgers and Me. He said, well, they wanted a book in 3 weeks. And, and he said, I managed to provide. And so Dad wrote that book in 3 weeks. And, and Dad ran into, Howard Cosell, in San Diego. And Cosell knew Dad and said, Dad said, hi, Howard. And Cosell said, the author of The Dodgers and Me, a book for which you received little of the credit, was your due. Harold, how are you? And so, Cosell knew that Dad had written the book for Leo. And, but it's another, piece of Harold Parrott's work.
Well, that's really neat. And that I think is really the mark of, a good writer who's a craftsman. I mean, you hear about some writers who struggle with writer's block, but, with the kind of, starting in newspapering and then going to, into baseball and the multiple hats he wore, I guess your dad never had the luxury of writer's block. He had to produce. And so to use his words, he managed to produce, and he produced well, indeed.
Yeah. So, you're so right. I mean, Dad could write, and, he put out those two works, and The Lords of Baseball, being made into a movie is a great thing, because many of the scenes were taken straight out of his book, the midnight meeting with Leo DeRocher, when Dad, as a traveling secretary in 47, several of the Southern ball players, Dixie Walker had put up a petition or made a petition saying that if Rickey actually brought a black player to the Dodgers that they would walk off. And Kirby Higbee told Dad about it. Dad then went to his roommate, Leo DeRocher, and said, we got a problem. Walker's circulating a petition. And Dad said, Leo was furious and said, all right, wake them all up. It was midnight. I want to meet them, in the commissary. And that scene in the movie where, Leo's in a bathrobe saying, I understand there's a petition going around. He said, as far as I know, I'm the manager of this team, and this guy's going to put money in our pocket. Does anybody here not need the money? He said, I don't care if he's black, white, or he's effing zebra. He's going to play on this team, and if you don't want to play on the team, we'll make sure you're traded. And so Leo was very solidly behind Jackie, and anyway, then Rickey came down. Dad called Rickey to tell him what was happening, and Rickey came down and met each Dodger one-on-one. Will you play with him, or he's on the team, or should we trade you? And that was, it generated some more interesting stories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, stories that have been told and retold through the decades, really such a seminal moment in baseball history, but your dad was there and he told the story first, and I still think he told it best. Well, this is a half hour, as I suspected, that has just flown by, but Brian Sidney Parrott, it has been a pleasure and an honor to speak to you. And one more time, I want to say, anybody listening who likes not just a good, but a great baseball book, if you have not read The Lords of Baseball by Brian's father, Harold Parrott, find it, read it. It's great. Final words, sir.
Well, no, thank you, Claire, and I appreciate your interest in all of that history. And it's always fun to talk about Dad and what he actually did, and he was involved with all that. And so anyway, people will not be disappointed. Sandy Koufax, one of the book signings I did, said, this is for Sandy, sign it for him. So I did, and I gave him my phone number. And Koufax called me, and he said, Brian, this is Sandy Koufax. I just finished your dad's book. I could hear his voice when I was reading it, and he loved the book. It's a great piece of history.
Yes, it is. All righty. Well, thank you again, Brian. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And until next time, stay tuned.